In July 1587, a group of around 115 men, women, and children approached the Outer Banks off the coast of what is now the U.S. state of North Carolina, hoping to finally establish England's first permanent colony in North America. In just 3 years, nearly all of them would be gone without explanation. However, the initial landing place of the colonists at the southern Outer Bank island of Croatoan, nor their second destination of Roanoke Island, were meant to be the location of their colony. Roanoke Island had been the location of a previous attempt by the English, specifically Sir Walter Raleigh, the financier and primary force behind the effort to establish a similar colony just 2 years prior. This colony faced a number of issues, including a lack of supplies, as their flagship had been damaged while navigating the Outer Banks, with much of the supplies being ruined by seawater, as well as violent interactions with the local Native Americans. In one instance, the English settlers accused a local Secatan village of stealing a silver cup from them. When the cup was not produced, the English burnt down the village and its crops. As time went on and spring came, the relationship between the colonists and the Secatan people was once again deteriorating, this time over the heavy reliance of the English on the Secatan food supplies. This food situation was made exponentially worse by the spread of influenza or smallpox through the native communities, which had a drastic impact on that year's fall harvest. This whole time, the English had mostly been dealing with the tribe through Granjanameo, the brother of the Secatan king Wingina. Granjanameo was a strong advocate for the English and their colony, having a heavy influence on his brother in promoting a friendly relationship between the two peoples. However, this friendly relationship took a turn when Granjanameo died, and his brother Wingina changed his name to Pemisipin, meaning one who watches. At the same time, he established a new temporary capital on Roanoke Island, a very short distance from the colony, which the English initially did not see as any sort of threat. Ralph Lane, the governor of the colony, sought advice from the now Pemisipin, hoping to leave the island to begin exploration of the mainland, beyond Secatan territory. Pemisipin supported this idea, and warned Lane that the leader of the Roanoke tribe was gathering allies for an attack on the English, with 3,000 warriors having committed. However, Pemisipin was not just in contact with the English. At the same time, he was informing the Roanoke chief, Menetonon, that the English would indeed be coming to the mainland, hoping to instigate a violent clash between the two groups. Except, this clash didn't happen, as when Lane's armed group of Englishmen reached the gathering of the various tribes, they caught them by surprise and easily captured Chief Menetonon, who told the English that Pemisipin had been the one to call this gathering in the first place. Through Menetonon, Lane gathered information on unexplored lands to the north, but was warned that he should bring a group of considerable strength with him, since to the northeast lay a rich and powerful king. Lane, upon receiving this information, planned to split his group into two, one to travel up north on the Chowan River, and the other to travel along the Atlantic coast and resettle the colony at Chesapeake Bay. This plan, however, would never come to fruition, as Lane decided to wait for additional supplies before moving the colony. When Lane returned to Roanoke Island unharmed, Pemisipin was taken aback and once again was convinced by one of his tribe, Ensenor, an elder, to support the English. However, just like the previous time, Ensenor died on April 20th, and relations between the Secatan and the English quickly fell apart once again. Pemisipin ordered the Secatan to vacate Roanoke Island, leaving the English alone to fend for themselves and find their own source of food. He had also devised a plan to attack the English, but this was revealed to Lane by a Secatan that he had captured and held hostage. This Secatan was none other than Ensenor's son, Skyko, who was hoping to honor his father's position on the English and support friendly relations. The attack was supposed to occur as Lane and other leaders of the colony slept at night, with them being targeted first in an ambush on the colony. Lane, hearing of this plan, had disinformation sent to the Secatan that an English fleet had just arrived, forcing Pemisipin to speed up his plan of attack. On May 31st, he gathered his allies to prepare for this attack, but Lane and his men attacked the Secatan that evening, and the next day staged another attack under the pretense of negotiating for Skyko's freedom. In this last altercation, Pemisipin was shot and ran into the woods, but Lane's men eventually caught up to him, bringing back his severed head as proof they finished the job. Pemisipin's head was then impaled on a spike outside of the colony's fort. Later in June, the colony would be abandoned when it made contact with Sir Francis Drake's fleet on its way back to England after campaigning in the Caribbean. Originally, Drake's fleet intended to deliver supplies looted from raids on the Spanish to the colony, but a hurricane that came in ended up sweeping the supply ship out to sea. When the storm subsided, Lane had convinced everyone to abandon the colony, and Drake agreed to take them back to England with his fleet. Just days after the colony was evacuated, one lone supply ship sent by Raleigh reached Roanoke Island, and 2 weeks later, an entire relief fleet sent by Sir Richard Grenville arrived with a year's worth of supplies and 400 men to reinforce the colony. After doing some investigating and questioning local natives, the fleet returned to England, leaving just 15 men to maintain an English presence on the island. After the fleet's departure, these men were attacked by a group of tribes from the mainland, with 2 being killed and the remaining survivors fleeing, never to be seen again. It was these experiences that Raleigh and those around him had in mind when considering a second attempt. It took some convincing, but Raleigh was eventually persuaded to establish another colony, the city of Raleigh, with artist John White serving as governor and leading the expedition. In May 1587, White's group of around 115 people set sail from England to the Americas. They arrived a couple of months later in July and anchored at Croatoan Island, with White hoping to travel to Roanoke and meet with the 15 men that had been left on the island, before moving on to Chesapeake Bay. When White and his men reached the site of the Lane colony the next morning, they found its fort dismantled, houses abandoned, and witnessed an overgrowth of vegetation. Clearly, nobody had been here in quite a while. They did, however, find human skeletal remains, which White hypothesized had been one of the men left, and that he had been killed by a local native tribe. Shortly after, one of the colonists was killed by a native while crab hunting, and relations between the colonists and the local tribes became tense. After this incident, White hoped to reestablish relations with the Croatoan tribe, with the intention of negotiating a truce with the Secatan through them. White sent one of his ship's commanders with Manteo, a Croatoan that had been brought back to England after one of the first expeditions. Despite the re-establishment of relations, the colonists never received a response from the Secatan, even with the assistance of the Croatoan. With no word received, White led a preemptive strike against the Secatan, unaware that they had abandoned their village in fear of reprisal for the murder of the crab-hunting Englishmen. Not knowing that the people they sought were gone, the English accidentally ended up attacking a number of Croatoan looters. Despite this misunderstanding, Manteo was able to once again repair relations between the Croatoan and the English. As time went on, the colony's situation became more and more desperate, with the colonists deciding to relocate 50 miles up Albemarle Sound, and convincing Governor White to return to England in search of assistance and supplies. White and his fleet departed on August 27, 1587. Finally reaching England on November 5th. Upon their return, reports surfaced that the Spanish Armada was preparing for an attack on England, leading Queen Elizabeth I to prohibit any ships able to participate in battle from leaving. However, Sir Richard Grenville would be granted a waiver not long after, allowing him to sail a fleet to the Caribbean to attack the Spanish. John White was given permission to join this fleet with a resupply ship. The fleet was supposed to set sail in March of 1588, but was forced to stay in port due to adverse wind conditions. These conditions kept up until Grenville received new orders to remain in England with his fleet, as they might be necessary in the case of a Spanish attack. Eventually, 2 of the smaller ships in the fleet were permitted to leave England for Roanoke, as they had been deemed ill-fit for combat. On April 22nd, John White, the ships and their crews, departed England for the Americas. The journey wouldn't last long, however, as the captains of the 2 ships had decided to attempt to capture a number of Spanish ships along the way, hoping to increase the profitability of the voyage. On May 6th, while near Morocco, they were attacked by French mariners, with around 24 of the ship's crew having been killed, and the supplies meant for the Roanoke colonists being looted. After this altercation, White and the ships were forced to return to England. Despite the defeat of the Spanish Armada later that year in August, the ban on able ships leaving England continued to aid in the organization of the English Armada for a counterattack on Spain in 1589. Finally, 2 years after the previous resupply attempt, White would be granted permission to once again go on a resupply mission to Roanoke. White was given passage on a privateering expedition that spent most of the 1590 summer attacking Spanish posts in the Caribbean. On August 12th, the group reached Croatoan Island, and a landing party spent the following days searching for the colonists. They investigated a number of smoke plumes around the island, but each time found nothing. For 2 days, they attempted to cross the Pamlico Sound Lagoon but were unable to, losing a number of men in the process. The next day, they spotted a fire on the north end of the island, but were unable to reach it before nightfall and wouldn't risk coming ashore in the dark. The men anchored their boats and spent the night on them, singing English songs, hoping that the colonists would hear and recognize them, but there was no response given. On August 18th, White himself with a number of men came ashore and found fresh tracks in the sand, but no people. They then found the letters CRO carved into a tree, before reaching the site of the colony and finding that a defensive palisade wall had been constructed around the area. By the entrance of the colony, they found the full word Croatoan carved into one of the palisade's posts. White believed this meant the colonists had relocated to Croatoan Island without incident, as they had previously agreed in 1587 to leave a secret token revealing their location, or a cross pate if they were in distress. Within the walls of the palisade, they found that the colony's houses had been dismantled, buried trunks had been looted, and the colony's boats were missing, and anything that could be carried was gone. Plans to continue the search on Croatoan Island were abandoned when one of the fleet's ships, the Hopewell, lost an anchor cable. While another one of the ships, the Moonlight, set sail back to England, the crew of the Hopewell made an agreement with White to spend the winter in the Caribbean and then return to the area in spring of 1591. This plan would never come to fruition, as the Hopewell was blown off course and forced to head back to England after an unsuccessful resupply attempt in the Azores. While White and the ship's crews were unable to locate the colonists, this didn't stop further investigations from taking place, as White's reports suggested that the colonists could still be alive. Raleigh capitalized on this uncertainty, being able to maintain his legal claim on Virginia as long as the settlers' fate remained unresolved. Raleigh embarked on his first transatlantic voyage in 1595, claiming to search for the lost colonists. However, he later confessed this was a cover for his pursuit of the legendary city of El Dorado. On his return, he sailed past the Outer Banks, attributing his inability to land to unfavorable weather. As the price of sassafras soared, which can be found in abundance in almost all of North Carolina, Raleigh sought to enforce his monopoly on Virginia, relying on the Roanoke colonists' potential survival. In 1602, he funded a mission to the Outer Banks to resume the search, this time providing a ship and wages for the expedition's men, hoping this would dissuade them from engaging in privateering. Despite the stated goal, the ship's records revealed Raleigh's priority was instead harvesting sassafras south of Croatoan Island. When the expedition reached the Outer Banks, adverse weather hindered further exploration. Raleigh's later involvement in the main plot to remove King James I led to his arrest for treason in 1603, ending his Virginia charter. A final expedition later that year, led by Bartholomew Gilbert, aimed to find the Roanoke colonists. Their intended destination was Chesapeake Bay, but inclement weather forced a landing nearby. On July 29th, a group of natives killed the landing team, including Gilbert, for reasons unknown, and the remaining crew returned to England with nothing to show for their journey. Naturally, a number of theories surrounding the disappearance of the colony and its inhabitants began to spring up. One theory suggests that the colonists indeed relocated, with some moving to Chesapeake Bay with the colony's boats, and the rest staying at Croatoan Island in anticipation of White. The group of colonists that went to Chesapeake Bay are believed in this theory to have integrated with the Chesapeacan tribe, and those at Croatoan Island assimilated with the tribe that shared the island's name. Other tribes and native peoples have been thought to have integrated the colonists within their ranks, as Native Americans with pale skin and blonde hair were reported as far back as 1607. Many, however, believe this can be explained by the relatively higher rates of albinism among Native Americans. Another version of this theory holds that the colonists were all killed in an attack by the Powhatan, after attempts to kidnap natives to bring back to England. Some believe that the colonists decided to attempt a voyage back to England, rather than sit and wait for help to come to them. A voyage such as this was not completely out of the question, as French settlers had previously constructed a rudimentary ship and successfully sailed from what is now South Carolina back to Europe. Had the Roanoke colonists attempted a similar voyage, clearly it was not successful. However, many have pointed out that even with the ship they had and the construction of a second one, at least some of the colonists would be forced to remain in the New World, with the ships unable to transport everyone back to England. Other theories include a conspiracy against Raleigh to ensure the colony's failure, a Spanish attack on the colony, and the relocation of the colonists to the Chattahoochee River Valley, something that was described on the Dare stones supposedly inscribed with messages from the missing colonists, which many today believe are forgeries. All save for the first one discovered, whose authenticity is still up for debate. Another piece of evidence lies in one of John White's maps, which you've been seeing already. This map contains a number of patches that weren't removed until the early 2010s. One of these patches was placed over an area up on the Albemarle Sound, around where the colonists had intended to move before White's return to England. Under the patch was a symbol that typically indicates the location of a fort, created with the same paint used on both the original map and the patches, meaning that this is likely White's work. Strangely, another symbol like this surrounded by squares is painted on in what is assumed to be invisible ink. Despite all of these theories, investigations, and modern scientific research, the true cause of the colonists' disappearance is still unknown. No skeletal remains have been recovered for analysis, and no living descendants have been identified through DNA. Today, the lost colony of Roanoke remains one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in American history.